Nana, Chairman, and Togbi, Chairman of the Advisory Council. I believe the Archbishop of Accra and the Chief Imam are gone, but I would still like to acknowledge them and acknowledge Ebusiapenyin Kadman, who now has to become the Asumdwehene. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to be asked by the President Mills Memorial Heritage to speak at the 10th anniversary event, commemorating the passing of a remarkable human being whom I was privileged to have known from our days at the Faculty of Law, University of Ghana, Legon. He was 3 years my senior when we were students, and we later were colleagues when teaching. He was president for just over 3.5 years, having served earlier from 1996 to 2000 as vice president. President Mills earned global respect as an exemplar of integrity in political leadership. I want to suggest that the impact of his leadership goes beyond his lifetime, and that now more than ever, his legacy is critical for our nation's future. We can recall how in death he brought the nation to a unified acknowledgement of his stature in a manner that has been without equal. Even political opponents of his could not help acknowledging what he represented for the country and how his character had been an important stabilizing and moral force for our collective good in that period. I'd just like to ask us at this stage to recall in our minds the national acknowledgement when news of his death broke, right up to the solemn funeral attended by international dignitaries, including the presidents of neighboring Cote d'Ivoire and Togo, Mr. Kofi Annan, and the then US Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. In death, the strength of Professor Mills' personality and his stature as Asumdwehene brought this country together in grief in a very powerful way. I've been excited to learn of the countrywide nature of the memorials that are being organized to honor President Mills and the long-term plans of the memorial heritage. This is because I am convinced that his stature will grow bigger and bigger in the years, decades ahead. I have that conviction because of the outstanding legacy of integrity that he has left behind. That is what I've chosen to highlight today under the theme for these memorial events, the man John Evans Atta Mills, 10 years on. I believe that his legacy is even more vital today amidst the travails of our nation, as well as what I see as a global crisis of leadership. Today, more than ever, we can appreciate the importance of the human qualities of the man John Evans Atta Fifi Mills. So I would like to start with some remarks about the man. I will then consider how he got into his roles in politics and proceed to outline a few of his important achievements as president. It will not surprise you that I will dwell a bit on achievements in the oil and gas sector and highlight the relevance of those achievements for the future of that sector. It will be my thesis, broadly, that the life and work of President Mills represent a gold standard of leadership which our nation desperately needs. I will be insisting that, especially for our youth, President Mills shines a clear light for our nation's future, which we cannot just applaud or even just claim to be inspired by. Our honoring his memory is not so much about raising physical monuments to him, but more about ensuring that his legacy of integrity is given full meaning in our nation and in what we demand of our leaders as well as ourselves. Since Sunday morning, 24th July 2022, we have seen at Asomdwee Park, President Mills' resting place, that what is now inscribed over his grave and under his bust does not even have his name. Was he really the one being honored in that event where this inscription was unveiled? But I can almost hear him, after listening to me utter those last two sentences, saying calmly, "Oh, Dama, mankasa why? Oh, really, don't bother about them." And then asking me to move on to the more important subjects that he and I need to discuss. President Mills aspired to a better Ghana. That is undoubtedly a shared aspiration we all have as Ghanaians, unless the circumstances of our absurd partisan politics make some refuse to share that aspiration because it was espoused by someone from a political party other than the one they belong to. We shall look at how even his short time as president saw some important steps he took towards that better Ghana agenda. And more importantly, how his human qualities can help our quest for a better Ghana, our resolve to make our nation great and strong. Let me stress from the beginning that I do not seek to idolize President Mills, because that would not even be fair to him. He was a servant leader who never sought to be idolized, and he would not accept that. He was indeed a human being and had his limitations and weaknesses, just like all of us. What I'm interested to do on this occasion, commemorating the 10th anniversary of his death, is to distill from his life qualities that are worthy of our attention and emulation. President Mills was a man with a deep devotion to Ghana and to public service. From his days as a lecturer in Legon, teaching both at the Faculty of Law and the School of Administration, his subjects being company law and tax law, Through the time of his involvement in the reform of the country's revenue agencies, and then his becoming vice president and eventually president, his life was one dedicated to the country. He did not seek to enrich himself or his family or friends in the cause of any of his commitments to serve. His simplicity, humility, and modesty, combined with his integrity, meant that he was fundamentally seeking the public good and not his personal benefits. As president, he would often sacrifice personal comfort and convenience to spare the nation undue expense on himself. He was frugal about expenditures at the presidency and thus set an example for his staff and for his ministers and other public servants. It was never about his entitlements, but rather what the people he was dedicated to serving were entitled to expect from a leader like him. Sadly, some believe that politics is all about winning power with no moral boundaries. It's all about enriching oneself. President Mills was the polar opposite of that mentality. On the 18th of June 2008, speaking at a forum, yes, you know what happened on the 18th of June 2008 to me. Speaking at a forum organized by the Institute of Economic Affairs, he said with deep meaning, and I quote, "There can be no doubt that the 2008 election is also about leadership and character, about the human qualities of the person into whose hands the people of Ghana are going to entrust their future. I, Atta Mills, bring to the table the core values of truth, honesty, and humility which have guided me through life. I believe political leadership and decency are not mutually exclusive," unquote. Throughout President Mills' political life, he maintained his human decency. This was, in fact, an important part of his political capital. He did not need to make promises or proclamations about his integrity. He lived integrity. The fire of integrity was evident in his famous encounter with customs officials at the Tema port when he was calling the officials to order over the corruption among them that was eroding the revenue base of the nation. He could express himself so vehemently and categorically because he himself embodied the virtue he was demanding in others. President Mills angrily turned away anyone who tried to make approaches to influence him with money. I recall an account he gave of some business people soon after he was sworn in as president, making overtures of arrangements which they indicated they previously had, which they wished to continue, involving making monetary provision for his needs. He drove them away fiercely, with a warning that if he heard that anybody in his government was accepting any payment from them, they and the recipient of the payments would be in serious trouble. We all know that it could never be said of President Mills, whether by the chairman of his own party or anybody else, that he himself was receiving everything at the castle and not allowing anything to come to the party. He valued the peace and unity of the country so much that he would not be goaded into seeking political vengeance by making people in the previous administration targets of persecution during his presidency. Though he was under pressure to expose wrongdoing that had taken place previously, he considered that his priority was to focus on the development of Ghana and the well-being of her citizens within a framework of unity. President Mills was not one to orchestrate the jailing of people he considered political opponents. He absolutely meant it when he said, even before becoming president, that he was going to be a president for all Ghanaians, irrespective of political party affiliation. He said in the speech that I quoted earlier, he said so in these words: "I'm committed to a decent, honest, humble, and truthful government to mend the broken trust between government and the people. I will be president for all Ghanaians, not the NDC, not my family, not my friends. I want to leave an enduring legacy of a peaceful and united country where there is opportunity and prosperity for all. And I want to be remembered as a president who restored honesty, truth, and sincerity to government," unquote. These words, spoken with conviction and absolute sincerity, reflected the fact that his character was a major part of what he was offering the nation. They reflected his assurance to us that he would not be succumbing to the temptations of political power. He lived up to those declarations totally. He was a father for all, as indeed a president should be. That may not exactly have been music to the ears of some NDC faithfuls, but President Mills said what he believed was the right thing to do, and he meant every word of what he said. The accolade as Asomdwene, King of Peace, conferred on him by popular acclamation was a recognition of his preoccupation with the peace and unity of the nation. That was also his nature, his temperament, peace-loving, soft-spoken, but make no mistake about it, he was firm in his convictions and would not yield to the dictates of others. When after the 2004 elections, there were calls on him to reject the results because of the way the role of the chairman of the Electoral Commission was usurped and the collusion between certain officials in the Electoral Commission and the incumbent government, he insisted that it was not worth spilling a drop of blood in the country simply because he was being denied the opportunity to serve as president. However flawed that result was, he decided not to contest it. He obviously believed he would live to fight another day. That was disappointing, even unacceptable to some, but that was his conviction. Being such a peacemaker was not a weakness. It was a mark of wisdom and maturity in a very polarized country. Those who thought his peaceful nature meant they could have President Mills do their bidding soon found out to their chagrin that they could not have their way with him. A hockey teammate of his has used the word grit to describe to me how focused President Mills was on the hockey pitch especially within that half moon in the opponent's half. That grit was to serve him well in his leadership roles and as a person. Of course, he was a great team player and always paid attention to the perspectives of others. This was also very valuable to him when he first got into the NDC and during his service as vice president and chairman of the economic management team. Even as president, he relied on his team in his role as the striker. President Mills had a tremendous work ethic. He applied himself tirelessly to whatever assignment he was undertaking. He could never be accused of laziness. Even in a period when he was not in good health, he kept pushing himself to work right until he had to be taken to the hospital. He knew how to face tough times with a determined spirit and with a focus on what he considered the essentials, an aspect of the grit that was his hallmark. He was insistent on being punctual and would not accept the typical excuses we often make for starting meetings or functions late. Here again, he led by examples. All these attributes of President Mills, his integrity particularly, were anchored in his Christian faith, which clearly gave him the inner strength to be himself and to stand his ground. His faith was a matter of the heart and not about outward appearances or symbols. He understood the words of Jesus Christ in John 4:23 to 24. But a time is coming and has now come when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the spirit and in truth. As president, he held a small gathering of worship and prayer on Sunday afternoons in a room between the president's living area and the castle and the office, and that became known as the chapel. There were those who ridiculed this and said he had turned the castle into a prayer camp. I'm told he was at that gathering on the Sunday, 22nd July 2012, before the Tuesday when he died. For President Mills, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Philippians 1:21. He strove to be Christ-like and chose to build for himself treasures in heaven and not on earth. He remained humble throughout his life, never assuming superior airs over others, always giving thanks to God for his life and recognizing that he was a creature just like others. When he was invited in 1996 by President Rawlings, may his soul rest in peace, to be his running mate, Professor Mills had not previously sought national elective office and had also not been involved in the political arena. He was an academic lawyer, not a politician, and certainly not involved in partisan politics. He was not somebody who sought political office. Rather, he was sought after to hold political office. Mills' integrity, as well as his humility and his dedication to public service, were clearly all character traits which attracted President Rawlings. He was sought after because of the contribution that he was thought he could make for the country and for the person, that is President Rawlings, and the party, the NDC, on whose ticket he was going to run. The choice of running mate at a time when those opposed to President Rawlings had been given a boost by his own former vice president joining their ranks was obviously an important one. Bringing in Professor John Evans Atta Mills proved to be an inspired choice that enabled President Rawlings and the NDC to retain the confidence of the electorate in the 1996 elections. Mills went on to prove himself an able, dedicated, and exemplary vice president. Professor Mills' character and personality, a person of integrity, someone who was peace-loving and not out to seek vengeance against political opponents, were huge positives. And his soft-spoken and gentle manner were an effective complement and balance to President Rawlings, whose own integrity and passion for the welfare of the ordinary man were obviously what made Mills accept to be his running mate. We must not forget, of course, that Professor Mills, as he was then, identified himself as an Nkrumahist and sometimes referred excitedly to the orientation that he received at the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute while a student at Legon. He was therefore very much in tune with the political orientation of the NDC and fitted easily within the tradition. At the time he was announced as the vice presidential candidate, I recall that many of his contemporaries would say of him that he was a good man, and then quickly go on to doubt if he could succeed in what they regarded as the dirty world of politics. I will demonstrate that President Mills was a success in politics while not allowing himself to be tarnished by the dirt. He sought to clean up the politics of our nation. By the end of the second term of President Rawlings, he was clear in his mind that the mantle of leadership should pass on to his vice president. There were, however, others in the NDC who thought otherwise, and Professor Mills had to face leadership contests, which now gave him the opportunity to show his political mettle. I believe that a key part of what made him such an attractive presidential candidate for the NDC in the 2000 elections, as well as in 2004 and then in 2008, had to do with his character, precisely his integrity, modesty, and humility. For his selection as the NDC candidate for the 2008 elections, Professor Mills had to withstand the challenge from a number of more established NDC personalities. And his success showed the clear grassroots backing from the delegates throughout the country for the person who they had not just seen operating as vice president, but whose personality and character had been exposed to them through the 2000 and 2004 election campaigns, and who they now viewed as beginning a new era for the party. So from a situation in 1996, when he could be described as a political neophyte and definitely a newcomer within the NDC, President Mills had become not just the leader and flag bearer of the party, the new face of the NDC, but he was the person who took the NDC from 8 years in opposition back to the presidency at the beginning of 2009. That was no mean political achievement, especially when we recall that he did not have at his disposal a fraction of the material resources that the party and government poured into their campaign. He could not do anything about the abuse of incumbency. He could not afford the huge, expensive billboards of his opponent. True to character, Professor Mills then launched what he called a door-to-door campaign, preferring direct encounters with the people whose votes he was courting through the length and breadth of the country. This was derided at that time by those in power. It was poor boy politics. But it has since become recognized as an important strategy for political campaigning in the country, even if large, expensive billboards are still, unfortunately, dominating our political contests and defacing our environment. Curiously, ahead of the 2012 elections, President Mills faced a challenge to the renewal of his NDC flag bearership from none other than Mrs. Rawlings, backed by her husband. The overwhelming success of President Mills at the party's Sunyani Congress sealed his position as the leader of the NDC. Two things often stand out in my mind about that Congress. The first is the deepening of the support of grassroots representatives of the party for President Mills. That he did not have the backing of President Rawlings on this occasion did not matter to them. The second thing from that Congress that I cannot forget is the speech of his vice president at that time, Vice President John Mahama, who he had selected, you recall, as running mate at a time when others had other preferences. While backing Mills in that speech, Vice President Mahama offered a resounding message, couched in a wonderful storytelling style about the need for the unity of the party. President Mills was the person around whom a unified party now rallied. John Evans Atta Mills achieved political success with what I have called the charisma of integrity. Lack of integrity may seem to be politically successful for a time, but sooner or later, the deep human need for honesty and integrity breaks through. That is what we saw happen in Ghana in the election of John Evans Atta Fifi Mills as president in the 2008-2009 election. His integrity enabled us as a nation to call time on a previous era in which corruption was explained away as being as old as Adam. He was the option that exuded honesty, integrity, modesty, and all the character traits we have earlier outlined. At a time when corruption and political vengeance and the abuse of power were on full display from the incumbent government, and when Ghanaians were tired of the cycles of vengeance in our politics and disgusted with all the corruption, with natural resources being squandered for personal enrichment, Professor Mills was a breath of fresh air. Not only did he show that a good man with integrity as his banner can win in politics, but his election showed that character and virtue remain at the heart of human aspiration, and that even in politics, integrity matters. Deep in our hearts, most of us admire good men and women, and we aspire to be like them. Good men and women like President Mills are desperately needed in our politics to rescue us from the mire into which we have sunk. We have a responsibility to shape our politics so that good men and women can serve. Mills not only had the charisma of integrity, but also the aroma of integrity. Which he spread around him. And that sweet scent from President Mills is still in our midst today. That is why I am using this commemoration to challenge especially the youth of our country to make individual character and integrity critical determinants of who we place in leadership positions at all levels and in all contexts of our national life. Needless to say, corruption is more costly to the youth simply because they have a longer span of the future ahead of them. And what is squandered from national resources today leaves the youth with less resources to fix the country to be the country we want, such that we can live the kind of lives that we all aspire to. It is not only in Ghana that the yearning for leaders of integrity is being expressed with more and more urgency. Throughout the world, lack of integrity in leaders is being exposed as unacceptable. Leaders who lie, some repeatedly and pathologically, or who are full of empty words that they do not mean. Leaders who are merely flamboyant and pompous, but do not seriously address the needs of their people, are being rejected and seen for who they really are, and not what the political propaganda says of them. Even at the highest levels of global leadership, we have experienced such leaders, including one who lies persistently about an election he lost, and who has obviously provided an example for others about avoiding the truth in dealing with the electoral process. I was recently quite struck by how, in a debate amongst candidates for the leadership of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, when a question was asked directly, is Mr. Johnson honest, with a request of a yes or no answer, only one person heeded the request, answering no to applause from the audience. The person who answered no, I must point out, is no longer in the leadership race. None of the others could answer yes. They danced around the question with talk about mistakes having been made and so on and so forth. The person they were talking about was none other than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who had led his party to a massive electoral victory only 3 years ago, and yet whose character traits there have been issues about for decades. He's on his way out at last because his colleagues were apparently no longer comfortable with the lack of integrity. One of those colleagues has spoken about how attending a parliamentary prayer breakfast was the moment of truth for him. He says, I was listening to Reverend Les Isaac talking about the importance of integrity in public life. And just focusing on that, I made up my mind. I went straight back to my office and drafted the resignation letter and went to see the Prime Minister later in the day. Those were the words of Sajid Javid a former member of the cabinet of Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And in his resignation speech in Parliament, he spoke again about the prayer breakfast and about Reverend Liz Isaac speaking about, quote, the responsibility that comes with leadership, the responsibility to serve the interests of others above your own and to seek the common good of your party, your community, and above all, your country. Integrity was again his highlight. The public expects all of us, he went on, to maintain honesty and integrity in what we do. I have concluded that the problem starts at the top. We have also been seeing images recently of the crisis in Sri Lanka, which also tells us that there is a limit to the patience of a country after a long period of tolerance for a country that had been run as if it was a family business. And that had failed to address the dire living conditions faced by the people. A once very powerful president has had to flee from his country amidst the angry protests of the people who he had taken for granted for so long. The fact that in recent assessments of risks of debt default globally, Ghana and Sri Lanka are mentioned in the same breath means that we cannot be complacent about our situation. We can perhaps be spared that kind of tragedy in our nation if the commemoration of the life and legacy of President Mills signals us or signals to us a need to follow his example of leadership. I would not be doing justice to the memory of President Mills if it seems that his moral attributes are all there was to the legacy of integrity that I'm talking about. In being elected as president, he undertook to make a difference to the real lives of the people of Ghana. And so it is appropriate to consider how he fared in that regard. We must start with the recognition that President Mills inherited an economy that was in disarray, with the previous government living beyond its means and recording large fiscal deficits in 2007 and 2008. This led to high levels of inflation in those years. The debts owed to two energy sector institutions, VRA and TOR alone, by the end of 2008 were almost 2 billion and rising. Rather than any measures being taken to address the economic imbalances, it was regularly claimed that the economy was doing very well. To compound the situation for the incoming government, commitments had been made to the single spine salary adjustments for public servants without any resources being available for this, nor a real plan for revenue generation to meet those commitments. It is to the credit of President Mills that the single spine salary structure was implemented, providing most public servants the benefits of improved remuneration. He was committed to those improved conditions of service because he knew the sacrifices of teachers, of doctors, of nurses, of policemen, of soldiers, judges, officials in the judicial service, all the security service, and public servants generally. The implementation of the single spine salary structure was achieved through improvement in economic management under President Mills, particularly the prudent fiscal management, which also enabled Ghana to experience significantly lower inflation from January 2009. From a level of 16.5% in 2008, inflation came down to single digits, 9.7%, in the very first year of Mills' administration, 2009. In 3 of the 4 years from January 2009 to December 2012, Ghana had single-digit inflation. 2 successive years of single-digit inflation were recorded in 2011-2012. Such lower inflation, by protecting the value of personal incomes, itself improved the well-being of the citizens. Fiscal responsibility was clearly practiced under President Mills. High growth rates were also recorded throughout the period of the Mills administration. Ghana's growth rate in 2011 was among the highest growth rates in the world that year. Some seek to attribute the impressive growth rates and the economic performance under President Mills simply to the onset of oil production from the Jubilee field. No doubt, growth in 2011 was elevated by the new revenues, but even non-oil growth in 2011 was higher than growth in the previous years before the Mills administration. And this is shown very clearly in a report. I don't know whether these figures are being displayed to you, but there are clear records of the effect of the oil and the non-oil growth, which we can refer to. But it is also interesting comparing the level of oil production and associated revenues during the Mills administration with the significantly increased levels in the years from 2017 to date, because this also gives us a perspective. The oil revenues earned in 1 year, 2018 alone, under the current government are only about $8 million less than all revenues in the 2 years under President Mills, 2011 and 2012, when oil began to yield revenues. About 57% of all Ghana's oil revenues since 2011 have been available to the current government, as against 12% that was available to the administration of President Mills. More oil revenue was obtained during the 2017-2020 first term of the current government than in the term of any previous government. Despite these high levels of oil revenues, growth rates under the current administration have been consistently lower than under President Mills. Clearly, it is not the amount of oil revenue that matters. It is how that and all other revenues are managed for the benefit of the country. Credit cannot be denied President Mills for the improved economic performance, especially in terms of growth and inflation, as against what he inherited and compared to the current government, even though the oil revenue inflow during his period was so limited. There's a disturbing reality about our oil production that we need to pay more attention to than we have been doing. Since 2019, when a level of over 70 million barrels annual production was attained, production has been in decline. In 2021, just over 55 million barrels were produced. Significantly, it was a pipeline of oil and gas development projects from 11 new discoveries that were made during the 3.5 years of the presidency that led to the oil and gas production from the 10 and Sankofa and Jinyame fields. It is because of these that the level of oil revenues escalated from 2017. A similar pipeline of appraisal to development projects is urgently needed to reverse the decline in oil production that Ghana is currently experiencing. Ghana is still at a very early stage in uncovering the wealth of our oil resources, and there is every reason to be confident that the decline in production can be reversed for the good of the country. It will, however, require careful, well thought out, technically sound plans driven by what is in the national interest. More immediately, of course, we are faced with the issue of how best to utilize all resources to enable us climb out of our current predicament. The passage of the Petroleum Revenue Management Act 2011, Act 815, was among the important legacies of President Mills.